My name is Evelyn Marlowe, and I am 76 years old. People in this town know me for my garden. That little patch of green behind my cottage on Cedar Hollow Road has been my sanctuary for decades. Rows of hydrangeas that turn from soft pink to a deep, almost bruised blue as the season wanes, tomatoes that burst with flavor, roses that climb the trellis like they're racing the sun. I've tended it the way other people tend marriages or bank accounts, with daily devotion, gentle hands, and a patient heart. But even a garden can't keep certain ghosts away. Not the ghost of the man I loved at 19. Not the shadow of the promise he made. The one that still stung like a fresh wound 40 years later. His name was Daniel Hayes. Tall, with a half-smile that always made you feel like you'd been let in on a secret no one else knew. He could fix a car engine, build a rocking chair from raw wood, and charm your grandmother into giving him the last slice of pie, all in the same afternoon. I met him on the hottest day of July in 1967, when the air shimmered and the smell of sweet corn drifted over from the farmer's market. My hands were full of peaches. He caught one before it rolled into the street. I caught his eyes before I caught my breath. We were inseparable after that. Until the day he left. No goodbye. No letter. Just a silence so complete, it swallowed me whole. For years I told myself he must have died. Or gotten lost in some faraway war. Or maybe he'd been hit with some tragedy that made it impossible for him to come back. It was easier to believe in tragedy than to believe the truth, that he'd chosen to leave me behind. I never married after Daniel. I raised my daughter, Josie, alone, building a life that was solid, dependable. I worked at the post office for 37 years, saved every penny I could, bought this cottage, and poured my love into the soil because the earth never walks away. I thought I had buried the last trace of him in the quiet corners of my heart. Until last Thursday. It was late afternoon, the sun throwing long shadows across the lawn. I'd just come in from watering the roses when I heard it. A knock at my door. Slow, deliberate, like each one was meant to pull me toward it. My first thought was Josie dropping by unannounced. My second was the neighbor kid selling something for school. But when I opened the door, my heart lurched. There he was, Daniel Hayes, standing on my porch like 40 years hadn't passed. His hair, once the color of fresh chestnuts, was now silver, and his jaw had softened with age, but those eyes, they were exactly the same. That sly, knowing green that used to make my knees weaken. "Evelyn," he said, like the name still belonged to him. Like he had the right. I gripped the edge of the door, not sure whether to slam it or cling to it for balance. "Daniel." My voice came out dry like dust. He smiled, that same smile, but there was something behind it. Hesitation. Maybe fear. "It's been a long time." 40 years, I said. I didn't give him the satisfaction of softening it. His gaze flicked past me into the house. "You look good. You look alive," I answered. My words hung there, sharp and heavy. He flinched just barely. "I know I've got a lot to explain," he said, shifting his weight. "I was hoping maybe we could talk." I should have shut the door. I should have told him that whatever he had to say, it was 40 years too late. But my hand didn't move. My breath didn't either. Instead, I heard myself say, "Why now?" Daniel's jaw worked like he was chewing on the answer. "Because I didn't know where else to go." And blinked. "What do you mean?" His eyes dropped. "I've lost everything, Evelyn. The house, the business, my wife." I almost laughed. "Your wife?" He glanced up at me then, shame flickering across his face. "I'm not proud of how I left things. But I thought maybe you'd understand. Maybe you'd." I waited. Maybe I'd what? "Let me stay. Just for a little while. Until I get back on my feet." The audacity of it hit me like a cold wave. This man, the one who vanished without a word, who left me to raise a child alone, who became nothing more than a ghost in my memories, was standing here asking for shelter from me. My fingers curled tighter around the doorframe. You really think I'm the kind of woman who waits 40 years just so she can take you in when you're broke and lonely? His expression hardened just a little. I was hoping you were still the kind of woman who cared. I studied him, the lines in his face, the stoop in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled just slightly. There was a time I would have reached for those hands without thinking. Now I wanted to see if they could carry the weight of his own choices. Daniel, I said, my voice low. I waited 40 years, but not for you. I waited to become the kind of woman who doesn't need you. Something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not exactly, but something darker. And that's when I realized. He wasn't here just for a bed. He was here because seeing me stand tall without him was something he couldn't bear. Before I could speak again, Josie's car pulled into the driveway. Her door slammed, and her footsteps came up the walk. She froze when she saw him. Mom, who's this? I looked at her, then back at him, and I knew that whatever came out of my mouth next would open a door I couldn't close again. Josie, I began slowly, this is. And that's where we'll leave it for now. If you've been hooked by this story so far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can hear the rest. The past is about to open its jaws, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Josie, I said, my voice steady though my chest was pounding. This is Daniel Hayes, your father. Her face went pale, like someone had just blown out the light inside her. She stood frozen on the porch, her purse still dangling from one shoulder, her keys in hand. My father, she repeated, as if she didn't understand the word. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. Josie, you were so little when you what? She cut in sharply. When you walked out. When you left Mom with a baby and no money. I could see his jaw tense, but he didn't answer. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt in years. I stepped aside. Come in, Josie. Both of you. The three of us moved into the living room. The sun was low now, spilling golden light across the wooden floors, but there was no warmth in the air. Josie set her purse on the couch and crossed her arms. Her eyes locked on Daniel like she was sizing up a threat. He glanced around the room, the bookshelf crammed with old novels, the framed photographs of Josie's life, the handmade quilt draped over the armchair, and I could see it hit him. This was the life I'd built without him. Every detail screamed of independence. I didn't come here to cause trouble, he began. Josie laughed, sharp, humorless. Then why are you here? He glanced at me, then back at her. I needed somewhere to stay for a little while. Josie's mouth fell open. You're kidding. He's not, I said flatly. She turned to me. And you're considering it. I met her gaze. I haven't decided yet. The truth was, I didn't need to decide. I already knew what my answer would be. But I wanted to hear what else he thought he could say to earn his way back in. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I know I messed up. More than once. I was young, stupid, selfish. You were a coward, Josie interrupted. He flinched, but she wasn't wrong. Maybe I was, he admitted quietly. But I've had a lot of years to think about what I lost. And the truth is, I never stopped thinking about your mother. Kept my expression still. That's a convenient thing to say now that you have nowhere else to go. His eyes flashed. It's not just that. I'm not here to freeload. I'll work, I'll pay my way. He hesitated, I just need a place to land. The words hung there, heavy and desperate. Josie stood abruptly. No, absolutely not. Mom, you can't. Josie, I said, holding up a hand. I'll handle it. She shook her head, frustrated. I don't get it, Mom. After everything, why are you even letting him sit here? He doesn't deserve. This isn't about what he deserves, I said, my voice low. It's about what I decide to do. Daniel looked between us, sensing the rift. I'm not asking for much. Just a roof for a little while. You'll barely even know I'm here. Josie scoffed. Trust me, we'll know. I could feel the tension in the room tightening like a rope. And then, as if the universe wanted to make things even more complicated, there was another knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman standing there, mid-60s, elegant in a pale blue coat and pearl earrings. Her hair was silver and swept into a perfect chignon. She held a manila envelope in her hands. Mrs. Marlowe, she asked. Yes. She glanced past me into the living room, her eyes landing on Daniel. Her lips thinned. I see he's here. Daniel's face drained of color. Margaret. Josie looked between them. Who's Margaret? Margaret's eyes didn't leave Daniel. His wife. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ex-wife, Daniel said quickly. Margaret, what are you doing here? She stepped into the doorway, ignoring me entirely. I came to give you this. She held out the envelope. The divorce is final. And so is everything else. You're on your own, Daniel. He didn't take it. She let it drop onto the coffee table. Then Margaret turned to me. I don't know what he's told you, Mrs. Marlowe, but I suggest you think very carefully before you let him back into your life. He has a way of burning down whatever he touches. With that, she left, her heels clicking sharply against the porch boards until the sound faded down the walk. The three of us sat in stunned silence. Josie finally broke it. Well, there's your answer. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. It's not what it looks like. I tilted my head. Isn't it? Because it looks a lot like you've been tossed out of one woman's life and decided to see if you could crawl back into another. His shoulders sagged. I'm not that man anymore, Evelyn. Please. Just give me a chance to prove it. I studied him for a long moment, my mind running through 40 years of silence, of raising a child alone, of burying the hope that he'd ever come back, and now this. Finally I stood. You can stay. For 1 week. Josie's eyes widened. Mom. 1 week, I repeated, my voice firm. After that, we'll see where things stand. Daniel looked relieved. Thank you. But I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for me, because something in me needed to know if he could face what he'd left behind without running again. And maybe, deep down, I wanted him to see exactly what kind of woman I'd become without him. Still, as I turned away, I caught my reflection in the window, and I saw it in my own eyes. This wasn't just going to be about him living under my roof. It was going to be about me deciding how the story ended. And in 1 week's time, Daniel Hayes might regret ever knocking on my door. The first night Daniel slept in my house, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of movement in the hallway. The house had been mine alone for decades, and now there was a shadow from my past sleeping down the hall. A man who once knew my laugh, my fears, the curve of my cheek, and who had thrown it all away like a cigarette but on a windy street. At 2 a.m., I got up and padded barefoot into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, the coolness steadying my hands. That's when I saw the faint glow from the living room. Daniel was there, sitting on the couch in the dark except for the light from the street lamp outside. He was holding a photograph, one of Josie as a baby, her cheeks round and her tiny fists clenched. "I kept this in my wallet for years," he said quietly without looking at me. "You must have lost it along with everything else," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. His eyes lifted to mine. There was a tiredness there that hadn't been in the boy I'd once loved, a deep, bone-deep weariness, like a man who'd been running his whole life and had finally run out of road. "Evelyn, I know I don't deserve to be here, but I need you to believe me when I say I thought of you both every day." "Thinking about someone is cheap," I said. "It doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't change diapers or keep the roof from leaking. It doesn't show up to school plays or hold you when you're sick." He didn't answer. Maybe there was nothing left to say. I left him there and went back to bed, but that night confirmed what I already knew. His presence was going to stir up every ghost I'd buried. The next morning, Josie came over again, armed with muffins and a storm brewing behind her eyes. "You're really doing this?" she demanded, setting the bakery box on the counter like it had personally offended her. "1 week," I reminded her. "That's all. You don't owe him a week. You don't owe him a minute." "I know." I sipped my coffee. "But I owe myself the chance to see this through." She shook her head in disbelief. "You think people change? Men like him?" I didn't answer. Sometimes it wasn't about whether they changed, it was about whether you had. Over the next few days, Daniel kept to himself mostly. He was careful, polite, even helpful, fixing a squeaky cabinet door, replacing a burnt-out porch light. He seemed to understand he was walking on the thinnest ice. But I couldn't ignore the small ways the past bled into the present. The way he'd glance at me across the table as though searching for the girl I used to be. The way he paused when passing family photos. His fingers hovering like he wanted to touch the glass but didn't dare. And then there were the late-night phone calls I overheard. He'd step outside, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite catch. Every time I asked, he brushed it off. Just a friend checking in. But I'd learned long ago that secrecy was his native language. On the 4th day, I was in the garden pulling weeds when my neighbor, Ruth Miller, leaned over the fence. She'd lived next door for 30 years and had a nose for news sharper than any bloodhound's. "Is that Daniel Hayes staying with you?" she asked, eyebrows raised. I straightened, brushing dirt from my gloves. "Word travels fast. I heard he's been. Well, let's just say he's left a trail of unhappy women in more than one town." "Sounds like him," I said dryly. Ruth tilted her head. "Be careful, Evelyn. Sometimes old fires aren't worth rekindling. They just burn you again." I gave her a small smile. "I'm not the one in danger of getting burned." And I meant it. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and gold, Daniel joined me on the back porch. "You've done well for yourself," he said. His eyes scanning the yard, the neat flower beds, the painted birdhouses Josie and I had made years ago. "I had to," I replied. "No one else was going to do it for me." He nodded almost shamefully. "I'm glad you did." I turned to face him fully. "Why are you really here, Daniel?" "I told you." "No. The truth. Not the half-truth you've been feeding me since you showed up." His gaze dropped to his hands. "I lost everything. The job, the house, the marriage. I'm sick." The words hung there, heavy and suffocating. "What kind of sick?" I asked. "Nothing contagious," he said quickly. "Just time catching up with me. The doctors say it's not promising." I searched his face for the lie, but what I saw instead was something raw, unpolished, fear. "Are you here because you're sick?" I asked. "Or because you think I'm still the girl who'll save you?" He looked at me then, and for the first time in 40 years I saw no swagger, no defense. Just a man stripped bare. "Maybe both," he said quietly. That night I lay awake again, but it wasn't the sound of him moving through the house that kept me up. It was the realization that I wasn't angry in the way I thought I'd be. I was calculating. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was my chance to rewrite the ending he thought he'd left me with. If Daniel Hayes had returned expecting pity, forgiveness, or a warm bed to fall into, he was about to learn that the girl he left behind had turned into a woman who knew exactly how to make a man regret every wrong turn he'd ever taken. And I had 3 days left to decide exactly how I'd do it. By the morning of the 5th day, my plan had started to take shape. It wasn't about cruelty. I wasn't interested in lowering myself to his level. It was about truth. And making sure the truth sat with him, heavy and unshakable, for the rest of whatever time he had left. The first step was simple. Show him the life he'd forfeited, in detail so sharp it would cut him. I started with the photo albums. "These are the years you missed," I said, laying them out on the dining table. Josie's first steps, her prom, her college graduation, her wedding. Holidays with friends who had become family. Trips I'd saved for on a waitress's salary and sheer stubbornness. Daniel sat there, flipping slowly through page after page, his face tightening as the years rolled by without him. "You did all this without me," he murmured. "Yes," I said simply. When he closed the last album, I didn't offer him comfort. I let the silence wrap around him, because some truths don't need softening. But the second step was harder. I needed to understand why he'd left in the first place. Not the excuses he'd told himself, but the real reason. So that night after dinner, I poured 2 glasses of bourbon and slid one across the table to him. "Tell me," I said. "The truth this time." He stared into the glass for a long moment. Then, in a voice roughened by age and regret, he began. "I was scared," he said. "Not of being a father, though that was part of it, but of being ordinary. I thought if I left I could be someone. See the world, make money, live big. I told myself I'd come back for you when I was the man you deserved. But by the time I realized what I'd thrown away, I didn't have the courage to face what I'd done." I studied him, measuring the weight of those words. "So you chose running over love?" He nodded slowly. "And I kept running until there was nowhere left to go." It was almost midnight when he finally went to bed. I stayed up, alone at the table, my bourbon untouched. Because now I knew exactly how this week was going to end. Daniel thought he was here for a roof over his head. But by the end of the 7th day, he was going to leave with something far heavier. The knowledge that the life he had once been too afraid to live had been lived, fully and beautifully, without him. And I was going to make sure he saw every inch of it. By the 6th morning, Daniel had stopped trying to pretend he wasn't watching me. I'd catch his eyes following me when I moved around the kitchen, when I watered the plants, even when I bent down to tie my sneakers before going for my morning walk. It wasn't the gaze of a man in love. Not anymore. It was the look of someone who'd stumbled upon a treasure chest he'd once buried, walked away from, and only just realized was still filled with gold. The thing was, the gold had never been for him. That morning I told him to be ready by 9. "Where are we going?" he asked, suspicious. "You'll see," I replied, grabbing my keys. Our first stop was Josie's cafe. She'd opened it 10 years ago, with money I'd loaned her from the savings I'd scraped together over decades. It had been her dream since she was 15, to have a place filled with the smell of cinnamon rolls and strong coffee, where locals came not just to eat but to feel at home. When we walked in, Josie froze behind the counter, her expression hardening instantly at the sight of Daniel. "Morning, sweetheart," I said as though nothing were wrong. "I wanted to show Daniel what you've built." Josie's voice was clipped. I built this without him. I didn't flinch. I know. But sometimes people need to see the results of what they walked away from. Daniel's gaze roamed the cafe. The cozy booths, the chalkboard menu, the photographs of community events lining the wall. It's beautiful, he said softly. Josie's eyes narrowed. You don't get to say that. Not when you weren't there for the late nights, the empty bank account, the tears in the bathroom when I thought I'd have to close. Daniel swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. From the cafe, I drove him to the community center where I'd volunteered for the past 20 years. The director, Helen, greeted me with a hug and a smile. Is this your? She started, looking at Daniel. An old acquaintance, I said quickly. I gave him the tour. The kitchen where we cooked meals for families in need. The classrooms where I'd taught GED prep. The storage room filled with donated coats and blankets. All this, I told him, is what I did with the hours you left me alone. Instead of waiting for you to come back, I filled my life with purpose. He didn't reply, but his shoulders slumped slightly, as though the weight of it all was pressing down. After lunch, I took him to the lake. It was the same lake we'd gone to when we were 19. The same dock where he'd once told me he'd love me forever. Back then, forever had been 3 months. Do you remember? I asked, standing at the edge of the dock. Of course I remember, he said. I smiled, but it wasn't warm. This is where you promised me we'd build a house together. I used to come here after you left, thinking if I waited long enough, I'd see your car pull up. He looked away, shame flickering across his face. But you know what? Continued. One day I stopped waiting. I stopped thinking of this as our place and made it mine. I came here to watch the sunrise, to read, to fish, to breathe. And I never once wished you were here to share it. By the time we got home that evening, Daniel looked older than when he'd arrived. His face was drawn, his steps slower. Why are you showing me all this? He finally asked as I poured us each a cup of tea. Because, I said, meeting his eyes, I want you to understand that I didn't just survive without you. Thrive. You left thinking I'd crumble. But you were nothing more than a chapter one decided not to reread. He flinched like I'd slapped him. That night he didn't eat much dinner. Afterward I found him sitting on the porch, staring into the dark. I thought you might be glad to see me, he admitted. Not this. Glad. I let out a small, humorless laugh. Daniel, you were the first man I loved, but also the first to teach me how deep betrayal can cut. I waited for you for years. Birthdays, holidays, nights when Josie was sick and I was so tired I thought I'd collapse. I pictured you walking through that door 100 times. But every year that passed I pictured you smaller. Less of a man. Less of a reason to keep waiting. His jaw tightened. So this is revenge. No, I said. Revenge would mean I still care enough to want to hurt you. This is closure. I'm giving you the truth finally, so you can stop imagining you mattered more than you did. The next day was the 7th day, the day he was supposed to leave. But early in the morning, I found him in the kitchen with his packed bag at his feet. I'll go now, he said quietly. You've made your point. I walked him to the door. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the yard. Daniel, I said as he stepped outside. He turned back expectant. You came here looking for shelter, maybe forgiveness. What you got was a reminder that the world didn't stop spinning when you left. I built a life you'll never be part of. And I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it so you can stop looking back. His throat worked as though he wanted to reply, but no words came. He nodded once, then turned and walked down the path without looking back. When I closed the door, I felt lighter than I had in years. For 4 decades, a part of me had been waiting, even if I didn't admit it. Now that part was gone. Daniel had seen the woman I'd become without him, and I knew he'd carry that image for the rest of his life. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because it was the truest thing I could give him. The reality that I didn't need him, hadn't needed him in years, and never would again. And that was my victory. If you're still here with me, make sure you hit that like button, drop a comment telling me if you would have let him in at all, and subscribe so you don't miss the final moment, where the twist isn't about him but about me and the one thing I've never told anyone until now. The morning after Daniel left, the house felt impossibly still. Not the kind of stillness that comes after an argument, or even the stillness of an empty home after company leaves. This was the stillness of something settled. Something finally put in its place. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the sunlight spilling across the floorboards. It was the same kitchen I'd scrubbed on my knees when Josie was a toddler, the same table where I'd paid bills with shaking hands, wondering if I'd have enough for groceries that week. But today, the air felt different. Lighter, freer, like the last weight had finally slid off my shoulders. And yet, there was one more thing to do. It had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment Daniel knocked on my door. The one piece of my story I'd never told him, the one thread he didn't even know existed. 4 years after he left, I'd told people he'd disappeared into some new life, maybe remarried, maybe moved away. But the truth, I'd known exactly where he was for most of those 40 years. I'd known when he bought a little apartment in Charlotte, when he got a job at the car dealership, when he started dating a woman named Carol. I knew because he wasn't the only one keeping tabs. A man named Frank Mitchell, one of Daniel's own cousins, had been sending me updates every few years. Not because he liked me, not really, but because he couldn't stand what Daniel had done. A man doesn't leave his wife and baby like that, Frank had said the first time he called. Not without people remembering it. So I'd known when Daniel's life wasn't nearly as grand as he'd probably imagined it would be. I knew when Carol left him for a younger man. I knew when he was laid off, when he had to sell his car, when his mother died and he didn't have the money to fly to the funeral. I'd never told him any of it. But my real secret, the one that mattered most, wasn't about him. It was about the house. When Daniel walked out, the house we were renting was barely ours. A month later, the landlord gave me 30 days' notice to leave. I was 19 years old, holding a baby, with no husband, no savings, and nowhere to go. I moved into a drafty 1-bedroom apartment above the hardware store in town. For the next 12 years I worked 2 jobs, one at the diner and one cleaning offices at night. Every dime I could spare went into a little metal tin I kept hidden in the back of my closet. My goal was simple. I wanted a home no one could take from me. When Josie was 13, I bought my first house. It was small, needed more repairs than I could afford, but it was mine. I painted the walls, fixed the leaky roof with the help of friends, and planted roses out front. That house became my castle. Then, when Josie moved out and I finally had enough saved again, I did something I never told a soul. I bought the house Daniel had left me in all those years ago. Not to live in. No, I rented it out. Quietly. I owned it for nearly 30 years before Daniel showed up at my door last week. And he had no idea. That morning I decided it was time for him to know. Not because I wanted to brag. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because it was my final act of closing the circle. I wrote him a letter. I told him how, while he was running from responsibility, I was building a life brick by brick. I told him about the nights I fell asleep on the diner's breakroom couch, about the Christmases I spent alone so I could work double shifts for holiday pay, about the way Josie looked at me when I unlocked the door to our first home. And then, at the end, I told him, For the past 30 years, every time you've driven past that little white house with the green shutters, the one you abandoned us in, you've been looking at a home I own. Not you. Me. It's paid off in full. It's been mine longer than you were ever mine. And I will never sell it. Because it reminds me of the girl you left behind. And the woman I became without you. I slipped the letter into an envelope and mailed it to the address Frank had given me years ago. I didn't sign it with love or regret or even my full name. Just, Evelyn. 2 weeks later I got a reply. It wasn't a letter, not exactly. It was a photograph. The old house, my house, taken from the street. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, were 4 words. I never stood a chance. I stared at that photograph for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just set it in the kitchen drawer and went back to making bread. Because the truth was, I'd been ready for his return for 40 years. Not in the way he'd imagined. Not with open arms or old love rekindled, but with the quiet strength of someone who had built an entire life without him. And I had won. Now, when I walk through my home, I see more than walls and furniture. I see the proof of every choice I made to keep going, every time I got up when life tried to knock me down. I see the photos of my grandchildren, the flowers from Josie's garden, the books I've read on rainy afternoons. And I see me, not the 19-year-old girl abandoned with a baby, but the 78-year-old woman who stood in her kitchen, handed an old love the truth like a gift, and walked away taller. Daniel may carry regret for the rest of his days, but regret is not my burden. My burden left the moment I closed that front door behind him. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, let me tell you something. Whatever someone took from you, whatever they made you believe you couldn't survive, it is not the end. You can build something so solid, so beautiful, that the very people who doubted you can't stand to look at it. And when that day comes, you won't need revenge. You'll have something far more powerful. You'll have your life. Thank you for listening to my story. If you felt something while hearing it, if it reminded you of your own strength or your own comeback, please click like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You never know. The next story might be yours.